So as the Grant administration kind of wears on, we're going to look at different efforts that were made to alter the South both socially and economically, not always with positive results. Of the numerous groups that used violence to intimidate freedmen in the Reconstruction South, the most visible were the Ku Klux Klan, founded by Confederate veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866. Now, there were other associations that went by different names, but their increased assaults on freedmen and white Republicans simply became harder and harder to ignore. Confederate veterans had once talked of resisting federal occupation using guerrilla tactics, and it really is disconcerting to Northerners that this now seemed to be the case. Leading up to Grant's election, armed vigilantes of white Southerners would ride through black settlements at night and fire shots through windows. They also did things like leaving coffins at the doorstep of potential Republican voters, and these same voters were threatened with violence if they did not vote for Democrats. Now, this particular movement had its roots in the patrols that white Southerners had set up simultaneous to the slave codes of the early 1700s, in which Southern whites on horseback would actively patrol and monitor the movement of a region's slaves. And the Klan, they tried to present themselves as mysterious. You know, the bed sheets that they wore reflected the need for anonymity, even though everyone knew who was a part of it. And they had positions like Imperial Wizard, meant to scare people. Much of the election terror took place in the upcountry region of South Carolina, where there actually were more poor white citizens. These citizens were viewed as potential political and economic allies of the freedmen, so the intimidation intensified. From 1868 to 1871, one South Carolina county saw over 12 murders, over 600 whippings or beatings, and the burning of churches and homes. In early 1871, black residents of Union County, South Carolina, were accused of shooting a white moonshiner who had donned Klan robes to rob a whiskey wagon. The two suspects were dragged from jail and lynched, and in the ensuing days, up to a dozen men were either shot or killed, and two were never heard from again. It's an atrocious situation that's taking place down south. When news of what was happening became clear, Grant took action. He called upon Congress to pass laws to secure life, liberty, and property, and the enforcement of law in the South. Democrats believed it was a power grab, and one step closer to a dictatorship, but Grant pressed onward. The commonly called Ku Klux Klan Act was signed in April 1871, and it broadened the definition of a crime to include any conspiracy to deprive citizens of their rights, and it legalized the president to use military force and suspend habeas corpus to deal with said threats. Grant proved that he wasn't afraid to send in the troops to restore order and protect the rights of freedmen, and the suspension of habeas corpus allowed arrests to take place much faster than they would otherwise have allowed. This pressure eventually forced the Klan underground, where they remained for decades, but there were other associations that took their place. So in stamping out the Klan, there was a degree of effectiveness. Economically, the concept of sharecropping was the system by which slavery was practiced in everything but name. Now, a New York reporter traveled to South Carolina in 1878 and reported that black families who were farming their own land had diversified their livestock and crops, and they were in relatively good shape. Those who had to work someone else's land were generally given poorer pieces of land, and they had a much rougher go of it. The general idea behind sharecropping was that of a partnership between owners and laborers. All right, the owners, who may or may not live on the actual property, provided the land, seed, and tools for the crop. The sharecropper, of which 2/3 of sharecroppers were actually white citizens, the sharecropper provided their labor and expertise. They plant the crop in the spring, tend to it over the summer, and harvest in the fall. And at harvest time, it's divided between the owner and the laborer. Now, unfortunately for the sharecroppers, landowners persuaded state legislatures to favor their interests. By law, landowners received the first right to crops. That's the name that's given to it. If the harvest was bad and the crop was not enough to cover the owner's expenses, then the cropper would be left with nothing. These laws, called crop lien laws, allowed owners to dictate which crops were planted and harvested. Now, food would have been an ideal crop because the cropper could at least eat some of the harvest in a down year, but cotton was much more common. Contracts usually stipulated that croppers were required to purchase food and provisions directly from the owners at exorbitant interest rates. And because many were illiterate, they were simply taken advantage of. This system worked to tie freedmen and poor white farmers to the land and ensure a steady labor supply. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of this era is exemplified in the lithograph that you see. Now, from left to right, we have Senator Hiram Revels of Mississippi, and then Representative Benjamin Turner of Alabama, Robert DeLarge of South Carolina, Josiah Walls of Florida, Jefferson Long of Georgia, Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, and Robert Elliott of South Carolina. This lithograph hung in the homes of many black citizens well into the 20th century, and they were even visible in sharecroppers' homes when researchers from the Works Progress Administration visited in the 1930s. And this really served as a testament to how far black Americans had come in a few short years. This is 1872. 15 years earlier, the Dred Scott ruling had determined that these men had no rights and weren't even citizens. And now, here they are, representing their state, representing their districts in Congress. Now, unfortunately, this was short-lived because 20 years later, in 1901, the final black congressman, George H. White of North Carolina, would finish out his term. And it would be another 27 years until another black representative would join the House. That's Oscar DePriest of Illinois. A former Confederate state would not send another black legislator to Congress until 1973, when Barbara Jordan of Texas and Andrew Young of Georgia both took their seats in the House. So this lithograph serves as not only a testament to progress and advancement, but also a snapshot in time, because these individuals represent the 14 African Americans who would hold seats in Congress during this time, and specifically in the House. 8 were born into slavery, 6 were born free. But it's not going to be until the 1970s when this situation occurs again in the American South.